Pay close attention to what I am about to explain, because what I am about to walk you through is the single most consequential strategic shift happening in the world right now, and almost no one in mainstream coverage is explaining it correctly. The headlines give you war, missiles over Tehran, carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf, defense budgets measured in trillions. That is real, but that is the surface. The actual competition being fought underneath the explosions is not a military competition at all. It is an infrastructure competition, and the country winning that competition is not the one spending $800 million a day on bombs. It is the country that spent the last 20 years quietly wiring the entire developing world to run on its technology, its energy systems, its payment networks, and its industrial supply chains. By the end of this, you will understand the mechanism called the electrostate advantage, why it makes every American military victory in the Middle East strategically irrelevant to the actual competition, and what it means for your household, your savings, and the balance of power for the next 50 years. The war everyone is watching is not the war that decides the century. The war that decides the century is being won silently through export contracts and infrastructure agreements, and it has been underway for 2 decades already. To understand what is actually happening, you need to understand one distinction that almost no Western analyst is explaining clearly to the public. The distinction is between a petrostate and an electrostate. A petrostate is a country whose economic power, military financing, and global influence flows from its control over fossil fuel energy. The United States built the most powerful petrostate architecture in history through the petrodollar system, through its military presence in the Persian Gulf, through its guarantee of free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, and through the security denomination bargain that made the dollar indispensable to every country that needed to buy oil. That architecture delivered 60 years of American dominance. It funded the American military. It suppressed American borrowing costs. It made the dollar the reserve currency of the global economy. And it is now the architecture that the Iran war is visibly and publicly stress testing in real time. But here is what the petrostate framing completely misses. While the United States was perfecting its control over 20th century energy, China was building control over 21st century energy. Not oil, not gas, not the Strait of Hormuz, electricity, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles. The entire technology stack that powers the next century of human civilization. And the country that controls that stack does not need to control any waterway. It does not need to station troops anywhere. It does not need to spend $800 million a day fighting a regional power in the Persian Gulf. It needs to be the indispensable supplier of the infrastructure that every country on Earth needs to build the energy future their populations are demanding. China is that supplier, and it became that supplier not through military conquest, but through 2 decades of patient, deliberate, state-directed industrial investment that the rest of the world largely ignored while it was happening. The numbers make this concrete, and the numbers are the part that mainstream coverage consistently fails to show you in one place. China now manufactures approximately 80% of the world's solar panels, not 30%, not 50%, 80%. China produces roughly 75% of the world's lithium-ion batteries. It manufactures more than 60% of the world's electric vehicles. It controls the processing of the rare earth elements that go into every EV motor, every wind turbine magnet, every advanced military guidance system on Earth. And it has now become the world's largest exporter of renewable energy technology, earning more from its clean energy exports than the United States earns from oil and gas exports. Read that last sentence again. China earns more from selling the infrastructure of the future than America earns from selling the fuel of the past. That is not a marginal shift. That is a complete inversion of the global economic architecture that Western governments built their entire strategic frameworks around. And it happened without a single military engagement. It happened through factories, through subsidies, through long-term state planning across time horizons that democratic governments are structurally incapable of matching, through the deliberate decision to absorb environmental damage and short-term economic pain in exchange for owning the supply chains that the entire world will depend on for the next century. Here is where the mechanism becomes impossible to ignore. The developing world is electrifying right now, not slowly, rapidly. Africa has 600 million people with no reliable access to electricity. Southeast Asia is building energy infrastructure at a pace that has no historical precedent. Latin America is expanding its renewable capacity under pressure from populations that want clean energy, lower energy costs, and independence from fossil fuel price shocks. India is on track to become the second largest renewable energy market on Earth. Every one of these regions needs solar panels. Everyone needs battery storage. Everyone needs grid infrastructure. Everyone needs electric vehicles as their transportation networks modernize. And every one of them is being offered exactly those things by China at prices that no Western manufacturer can currently match. This is not charity. It is not diplomacy in the traditional sense. It is the construction of economic dependency at a civilizational scale. When a country builds its electricity grid on Chinese solar panels, when it builds its transportation network on Chinese electric vehicles, when its factories run on Chinese battery storage systems, it does not need to sign a military alliance with Beijing to be strategically aligned with Beijing. The infrastructure itself creates the alignment. The supply chain creates the dependency. The maintenance contracts create the relationship. China does not need military bases in Africa or Southeast Asia or Latin America. It needs service agreements, and service agreements do not require a carrier strike group to enforce. The contrast with the American strategic approach could not be more stark. The United States is currently spending more money on a single month of military operations in the Persian Gulf than China spends in a year maintaining its entire Belt and Road Infrastructure Investment Program across 140 countries. The American approach to global influence in 2026 is built on the same architecture it built in 1974. Military presence, naval supremacy, dollar-denominated energy trade, control of choke points. All of these instruments were designed for a world where energy meant oil and global influence meant the ability to project military force to where the oil was. That world is ending. Not tomorrow, not next year, but structurally, irreversibly, and at a pace that is accelerating rather than slowing as the economics of renewable energy continue to improve relative to fossil fuels. Every year that passes, the cost of solar power falls further. Every year that passes, battery storage becomes cheaper and more capable. Every year that passes, China's manufacturing dominance in these technologies deepens because the experience curve in industrial production rewards the producer who has been building the most units for the longest time. China has been building more solar panels, more batteries, more electric vehicles than any other country for longer than any other country. That accumulated manufacturing experience cannot be replicated quickly. It took China 20 years to build it. The rest of the world is not going to close that gap in 5. Now let me run the numbers because this is where it becomes your problem directly. The electrostate advantage does not arrive at your front door as a geopolitical news story. It arrives as a price signal and reaches your household through 3 specific mechanisms. The first is energy cost. Every country that successfully transitions its energy system to domestically generated renewable electricity becomes permanently independent from global fossil fuel price shocks. Your gas bill, your electricity bill, your grocery bill, all structurally connected to the price of fossil fuels. Countries that electrify using Chinese manufactured solar and battery infrastructure achieve energy cost stability that fossil fuel dependent economies cannot match. The United States is moving more slowly than almost any other major economy because its political system is structurally captured by fossil fuel interests that have every incentive to delay the transition. That delay has a cost, and the cost lands on your energy bill every single month. The second mechanism is manufacturing competitiveness. Chinese electric vehicles cost approximately half what equivalent American or European vehicles cost to manufacture. That cost advantage comes directly from China's dominance of the battery supply chain and its accumulated manufacturing expertise. The political response in the United States and Europe has been tariffs, but tariffs are a symptom management strategy, not a structural solution. They raise the price consumers pay without closing the underlying manufacturing cost gap. Your next vehicle purchase is directly affected by whether your government has a credible industrial strategy to compete with Chinese manufacturing or whether it is managing the symptom with import taxes while the structural gap widens. The third mechanism is the reserve currency question that your mortgage rate depends on. The petrodollar system suppresses American borrowing costs. It depends on oil being priced in dollars. Oil being priced in dollars depends on the world needing oil and needing American military protection of the oil supply. As the world transitions toward electricity, the structural demand for dollar-denominated oil declines. Not immediately, not catastrophically in the short term, but directionally and irreversibly over the time horizon that matters for your retirement savings and your mortgage rate. Here is the detail that makes this a prediction rather than just an observation. None of what I have described requires China to make a single aggressive military move. It does not require a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It does not require a Chinese naval confrontation in the South China Sea. It does not require any action that Western governments could point to as hostile. The electrostate advantage accumulates through commerce, through export contracts signed by finance ministers in countries that need electricity, through infrastructure agreements that developing world governments sign because Chinese financing terms are better than Western alternatives and Chinese delivery timelines are shorter. through the simple economic logic that a solar panel generating free electricity for 30 years is a better deal for a poor country than an oil import contract requiring perpetual foreign currency payments at prices set by a cartel. Every one of those decisions is rational from the perspective of the country making it. Everyone simultaneously moves the global economic architecture one step further from the dollar-denominated fossil fuel system that underwrites American power and one step closer to the electricity-denominated Chinese industrial system Beijing has been building for 20 years. The victory condition for China in this competition is not military, it is infrastructural. It is the moment at which a critical mass of the global economy runs on Chinese manufactured energy systems, settled through Chinese payment networks, supplied through Chinese industrial supply chains. At that moment, American military supremacy becomes strategically irrelevant because the competition will already have been decided by contracts signed in boardrooms and finance ministries across the developing world over the preceding 2 decades. That moment has not arrived yet, but the trajectory points directly toward it, and the Iran war is accelerating rather than reversing that trajectory because every dollar America spends on Persian Gulf military operations is a dollar not spent on the industrial strategy that would actually address the structural competition. The game theory resolves into 3 scenarios, and none restore the pre-2020 status quo. In the first scenario, the United States launches a serious industrial response, a Manhattan Project-scale investment in domestic clean energy manufacturing, battery production, and rare earth processing that credibly challenges Chinese dominance. This is theoretically possible. It is what the Inflation Reduction Act attempted to begin. It requires sustained political will across multiple election cycles in a system where the fossil fuel industry spends hundreds of millions every cycle ensuring that sustained political will does not materialize. The structural obstacles are not technical, they are political. In the second scenario, the world splits into 2 parallel energy systems, a Chinese-dominated electrostate bloc covering most of the developing world, and an American-aligned petrostate bloc covering North America and a shrinking share of global energy trade. The dollar does not collapse, but its global role contracts significantly. American borrowing costs rise. The exorbitant privilege of dollar reserve status erodes. The fiscal consequences land on your tax bill and your purchasing power over a decade-long timeline that makes them easy to ignore until they become impossible to ignore. In the third scenario, a technological breakthrough in battery storage or solar efficiency accelerates the economics of electrification beyond any political resistance. The petrostate architecture does not decline gradually. It collapses at a pace financial markets have not priced in, and the economic disruption reaches your household through energy market volatility and currency instability at a scale not seen since the 1970s oil shock, but in the opposite direction. The critical insight across all 3 scenarios is this. China does not need to win a war to win the competition. China needs the transition to electricity to continue. And the transition to electricity is driven by economics, not geopolitics. The United States can win every military engagement in the Persian Gulf and still lose the structural competition that determines which country shapes the next century. Britain won the Battle of Suez in 1956. It lost the structural competition for global influence within a decade. The country that controls the infrastructure of the future does not need to defeat the country that controls the infrastructure of the past. It only needs to make the infrastructure of the past obsolete. And obsolescence is not achieved through military force. It is achieved through manufacturing, through the patient accumulation of supply chain advantages that compound over decades into dominance that no military response can reverse. Watch 3 signals to track this in real time. First, the annual share of global electricity generation from renewable sources published quarterly by the International Energy Agency. When that number crosses 30%, the economic case for new fossil fuel infrastructure collapses structurally. Second, the price differential between Chinese and Western manufactured electric vehicles in markets without protective tariffs published by Bloomberg NEF. When that differential exceeds 40%, the manufacturing competition is effectively over. Third, the share of Belt and Road agreements including Chinese currency settlement clauses tracked by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. When that share exceeds 50% of new agreements, the alternative payment architecture has achieved critical mass, and the dollar's role in developing world trade begins its structural decline regardless of what happens in the Persian Persian Gulf. Those three numbers will tell you weeks before any headline does how fast the architecture underneath the global economy is shifting. China will not announce its victory. There will be no surrender ceremony, no peace treaty, no moment that cable news covers as the end of American global dominance. There will only be a gradual accumulation of infrastructure agreements and export contracts and manufacturing cost advantages that one day add up to a world where global economic life runs on Chinese foundations rather than American ones. That world is not inevitable, but it is the trajectory that current decisions are producing. The war behind the war is not fought with missiles, it is fought with solar panels, and the solar panels are made in China.